Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma. And today's stuff is sponsored by Randy Schuster in loving memory of her father. He taught me to love Israel and love learning. He died too young, but left a lasting impression on me and many generations to come. Today's stuff is sponsored by Judy Auerbach in loving memory of her father's 35th year at site. His wisdom, advice, love of Judaism, and general daily behavior still guide me all these years later. We're going to get started with the beginning of our daf. Nehardea. I'll just remind you that we were in the middle of discussing this statement, and we spent most of yesterday's daf surrounding the statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, one cannot sanctify an item that was stolen from them, even if they didn't yet give up hopes of getting it back, because no one can actually sanctify it at all. The thief, because it's not theirs to sanctify, and the original owner because it's not in their domain. There's a big debate about whether, among the commentaries, and some basically use the continuation of today's daf as support for this, since Rabbi Yochanan made a statement specifically about sanctifying an item, is this something, and again, we talked about this yesterday, about the fact that this is a very fascinating statement in terms of ownership. This basically means that I don't really have full ownership rights over something that is not physically in my domain. Somebody took from me. So that's a good question, whether this means in general, or is it only for purposes of sanctifying something? Or does this apply across the board for any kind of ownership issue? As it could be that Rabbi Yochanan means it, particularly if I'm going to sanctify. In order to sanctify something, it has to be in my possession. But it doesn't mean that in order to do other things with it, it has to be in my possession. I still might be considered the owner of it, and I still might be able to do other things. But perhaps it's only I can't sanctify it. Or perhaps that's just a ramification of basically it being not in my domain at all. And that's a debate that the later commentaries have about this. Okay, it's not clear. Rabbi Yochanan specifically said about sanctifying. It's not clear how far he went. And we're going to see two different versions of Nehardea, and you're going to see this in possibly, again, it's not clear, but possibly this is what's motivating the two different variations of what the rabbis in Nehardea said. And we're going to talk about today, in the beginning of today's stuff, until we get to the Mishna, is basically what we would call nowadays, and it's not exactly, but it's somewhat similar to a power of attorney. What is power of attorney? I give my rights. Let's say I want to collect a loan from somebody, and we're talking about specifically power of attorney, where I'm appointing someone to try to plead my case and get money from someone else who I claim has my money in their hands. That's called, and what they're going to call it is an orkheta. An orkheta or orkheta is a document that basically gives over rights to someone. Okay, there's a debate exactly what this document is, but I'll try to say this as simply as and as basic as we can. Let's say, I'm giving you rights to go collect something of mine that someone else has. Like I loaned someone money. And now I ask you to please go collect the loan from that person, okay? And I write a document that says, right, I don't want to do it myself. Either I'm not good at it, or I don't have the time, and I'd rather pay someone to do it, whatever it might be. I write an orkheta that says, please go seize go get my property, whatever it is, from this other person. That it's mine, really, but it's in their hand. Now you see why Rabbi Yochanan connects, because what am I doing? I'm giving you rights to go take something that's mine. I'm passing over my rights to the object, to you, to basically seize this object that's in someone else's property. So in Nehardea, they say the following: Lo katvin an orkheta metaltale. You can't write it on movable property based on Rabbi Yochanan, and that's what Rashi is going to say. I'm Rav Ashi lamemer. In other words, I can do it about property, because property is different. But Rabbi Yochanan's statement about someone who steals something from me is about movable property, money, objects. My time. How can I pass on rights and tell you go seize this property from so-and-so who has it in their possession and it's really mine, when I don't have rights to it, direct rights to it? I don't have the rights to pass on the power of somebody else to retrieve something that's not in my domain right now. I can tell you to go to my house and take something that's mine. Sure, I can do that. But I can't tell you to go to someone else's house and take something that they have that's mine, because of this halacha of Rabbi Yochanan. So he basically makes it very difficult to do a power of attorney on movable property. Okay, at least a power of attorney in this way. Again, there's other powers of attorney, but this kind of power of attorney, which basically says, go seize my property, this person owes me money, go get it from them. I can't send you to do that because it's in their possession. And that would mean, now, according to this will lead to the next one. It doesn't matter if you agree that you owe me the money or whatever, this person, let's just call the person Jane. If Jane agrees that she owes me the money or doesn't agree that she owes me the money, it doesn't matter. I still can't send you to do it because I can't give you rights to get something that's mine that's in someone else's possession because I don't have direct access to it. Some people say that Nehardea wasn't basing it on Rabbi Yochanan at all. And this is why some say because Rabbi Yochanan didn't apply to this case because Rabbi Yochanan was only talking about sanctification. That's one way to read it. Another way is just they didn't hold by him. Lo katvin an orkheta metaltele de kafle. It's only if Jane denies my claim. If she says, no way, no how, I don't owe you any money either, right? We had a loan, but I paid you back already, or whatever it is, she denies the claim, then it's a problem. But if she doesn't deny the claim, or she doesn't say, I don't know what you're talking about, I could send someone to seize the property. Why? Tama de kafre de mipse kashika. Avalo kafre katvina. It's only because she denies the claim. Now, if I go tell you, go seize my property that's in Jane's domain, when Jane doesn't claim that she owes it to me, okay, let's say it was an item I gave her to watch, and she claims, what are you talking about? You didn't give this to me to watch, it's mine, or money from a loan. If I send you to get that and I write in this document, it looks like a lie because perhaps I'm lying. We don't know who's right. So it looks like a lie, the document. You can't write a document that looks like a lie. V'amre Nehardea. Another thing that Nehardea said. By the way, there's a good footnote in the Koran. I wanted to just read because I think it's very important. We don't always have to go into halacha. But he says here, okay, in the halacha section, if one claims that he owns movable property or money that's currently in the possession of another, and the latter denies that he owes it to him, that's what we just read, the claimant may not write a document of authorization to enable a third party to collect the item, because this document has the appearance of falsehood. That basically is what we just said. But here comes the interesting part. So first of all, it says this ruling is in accordance with the second version of the statement of the sages of Nehardea, okay? But then it says that later the Gaonim instituted that an authorization may be issued to collect a debt, even if the party who supposedly owes the money has denied the claim. If it's a loan, the Gaonim basically overrode this halacha. This is why I think it's interesting, because you can't really function without power of attorney, right? It could be in those days, maybe people didn't use power of attorney so much in Nehardea in the time of the Gemara. But by the time of the Gaonim, this was common practice. I'm suggesting, I don't know, but obviously the Gaonim saw a need to override this halacha. And they basically said, they limited it. They said it's only if you have a promissory note, not for loans by oral agreement. In other words, you have to have some basis that you're right. But once you have some basis, you can appoint a power of attorney, like an authorization for someone else to do it. Okay? And yeah, others maintain that you can even do it to collect loans by oral agreement. You see how far they went over time to allow this, despite the fact that the Gemara seems to say no. Okay, even if the payee has denied owing the money, as they claim that the concept of appearance of falsehood doesn't apply in this case. They basically rejected this concept of this doesn't look like falsehood. Okay, if there was a claim that there was a loan, then it's not a falsehood. So it's very interesting what happened to this. In other words, first we thought it was incredibly strict. You can't ever write it. Then we limited it to, right, the second version. Well, only if they deny the claim, you can't write it. And then the Gaonim later said, well, actually, you can do it as long as you have a written document. And then later people said, even if it wasn't written agreement about the loan, you still could write it. It seems that there's this, right, this move toward being more lenient in this area, despite the fact that the Gemara seemed pretty strict about it. Now we're going to continue along these lines about this orkheta and get off a bit on a tangent about it, which is Amre Nehardea. Orkheta de lo ktive. They're now raising other issues about this orkheta. It was clear that power of attorney didn't work the way it works nowadays. Now it's very simple. Okay, I sign all my rights. My lawyer could take care of whatever I need them to take care of, right? They could do anything for me. They go to court for me. I don't have to show up sometimes, right? Depending on the situation. But we use this all the time. So now they say, orkheta de lo ktive zil dun uzache va'apik lenafsha. If I don't write the following words, this sounds crazy. Go to the court, right? Zil dun, like go deal with it for me. Uziche, and you acquire the rights to whatever it is that I'm trying to claim back. The apik lenafshach, and it can be for you. Basically, if I want them to go to court for me, I have to give them rights to whatever it is I'm claiming, which is crazy because then theoretically they could opt on those rights. And we're going to talk about that soon. If you don't write those words, it's meaningless. They can't go to court for you. Why is that? Or they can't even go to the person's house and claim, give me the money. Because my time, because the other side could say, who are you? I never had an agreement with you. They could say, what are you doing here? And the fact that they have a power of attorney signed, they could say, I don't have anything to do with you. That doesn't make a difference to me. Unless I give them rights. Let's say it was $100 that I lent you, that I lent to Jane, and I appoint you to go collect the money from the $100. So if I say I give you rights to those $100, then when you go to Jane, you say to her, look, the money's now mine because Michelle gave me rights to it. And then Jane can't say, oh, what are you doing here? Okay. So that's a very interesting thing. And Abaya is going to say there's a major ramification of this, which is, so first, before we get to the major one, this is minor, but Amar Abai ikti be'lemechza l'shlishu l'revia migo de mishtai dina palga mishtami dina kula. Abai makes this a little bit easier, okay, and says, well, as long as I gave you a percentage of it, if I say, okay, now sometimes I'll say to you, listen, if I win the case, I'll give you X amount, right? I'll give you, $100. That won't work. But if I say, or let's say with $100, I'll give you $20. But if I say I'll give you 20%, or I'll give you 30%, or I'll give you 40% of whatever it is, then I've actually given you rights to the object, enough so that you can go argue your claim directly with Jane, because Jane can't say you have nothing to do with this because you have a percentage of it. Okay, remind me, when I bought a house, we had to pay a high tax, and it was known that there's a woman who her job, what she does is she argues cases to get the tax lowered. And because usually they charge more. I don't know. I didn't really understand the whole thing. I really didn't get involved. Basically, she says, and I just take a percentage of it. So it's win-win. In other words, if she wins and gets money back, you'll get 75% or whatever it is, 60%, and she'll get 40%. And it's just money in your hands. So that was an exact case of she had rights of a percentage, as opposed to usually you hire a lawyer and you pay them a fee for what they do, and they work, they run your case, but they don't have any rights to what you're claiming at all, not at all. So now we basically said, again, let's just go back for a minute. In Nehardea, they added this thing that basically they have to get rights to it, which in a minute we're going to see exactly what you were asking, Becky. Do they really have rights to it? Can they then take it for themselves? And so that has to be written into the document. But Abai said, as long as you give them a percentage of it, that's fine. Okay, it has to be written as a percentage. Then basically, since they have rights to part, they can obviously go argue the whole thing. Amra Meimar, itafis lo mafkina mine. Now here comes the big line, and there's different ways of understanding this, but we'll go with the basic, which is, if then you're my lawyer and I gave you rights to the object, according to the first interpretation, I gave you full rights. If you then seize the object for yourself, I can't get it away from you, basically. So it's a little dangerous to do a power of attorney because they could turn on you and they could just take it for themselves, and I will have no right to demand it back because in the orkheta, I basically gave them all the rights to it. Rav Ashi Amal, okay, he says, what are you talking about? Okay, and this makes sense. It's crazy to say that. Since also in the orkheta, there's another line. Okay, this is how we find out what documents said in those days, because we're getting bits and pieces. This one says you have to write this, and this one says since it says this in it, so now we know it at least has that line and it has this line. So what else? We don't know everything it says in there, but we know part of it, which is, there's different interpretations of this line. Some people say this means that in the orkheta it says, but I agree, me being the baldin, the one who's the main claimant, I'm hiring you to be my miyapeh koach, my power of attorney, to have power of attorney. But I am saying that whatever expenses of the case are going to be on me. Perhaps it's talking about expenses. Perhaps it's saying any evidence they want me to provide, I will provide, or something along those lines. I'm basically showing that I'm a part of this as well, and that this is my case. Therefore, comes Rav Ashi and says, Shaliach Shavye. I'm really only making the attorney my messenger. They don't have rights to take the property for themselves, the money for themselves. No way. Some people say Shutaf Hashavye. And here there's this machloket. What is the role of the attorney? Are they just my messenger, which is what we would have thought? That's usually the way we view power of attorney. Or do they become a partner with me in the claim? Which, by the way, like the case I gave you of the tax, where this woman was basically like a party in the case, because if she won, she would get it. If she didn't, she wouldn't. That's more like being a partner. And we all know that there's ways of hiring lawyers. Some are similar to a shaliach, you're paying them by the hour. Some are based on contingency, right? If they win, then yes, they'll get money. If not, they won't. And that's more like they're a partner. So there's a machloket here about how we view this power of attorney. L'may nafkamina, what's the relevance? Well, l'mitpas palga. If they grabbed part of it, right? Let's say they were the ones who the money got given to because they were the representatives, and then they decided not to give me the whole thing. Well, if we view them as my partner, then they have rights to half of it. If we don't view them as my partner and they're just my messenger, then they have no rights to it at all. And orkheta, not a surprise, shaliach shavyu. We do view them in the end as just a messenger. They're not really a partner in the case, and they don't really have rights to take the money. Okay, that's very interesting sugya. It didn't have so much to do with our topic, but yet a very interesting sugya. Okay, now we're going to move back to our topic, new Mishna. Now we're going to talk about testimony. We're going to start with witnesses that come and say you stole. Now remember, we're talking about stealing, and then we're talking about selling or slaughtering, right? So if you steal an animal, you pay kefil. If you steal and you slaughter the animal after or sell the animal, then you have to pay already 4 or 5 times. Okay, the 4 or 5 times is in addition to the kefil, and the meaning it's included, right? You pay double for just stealing, and then another 2 or 3 times more if you sold or slaughtered. It doesn't mean altogether you pay 7 times. It means you pay 2 and then up to 4 and 5, including the double. So now we have a bunch of situations. This mission is going to have a few parts to it. Ganav al pishnayim. 2 witnesses claim that you stole. They said, I saw you stealing. V'tavachu machal pihen. And the same witnesses says, not only did we see you steal, we saw you slaughter or sell. It always says tavachu machar. It means either or. Al pishnayim acharim. Or it doesn't matter. You could have 2 witnesses about the theft and 2 different witnesses that saw you slaughter or sell it. You'd be obligated the kefil based on the first group and the extra payments based on the second. So you're liable whether it's the same 2 witnesses or whether it's 2 different groups of 2 witnesses that each testify about each action. But what makes this very interesting, and this is going to be the sugya in the beginning of the Gemara on this, is how do we view actions, obligations that come about by 2 different actions, right? You can't, if someone testifies I slaughtered an animal, I'm not going to be chayav to pay 4 or 5, only if there's proof that I also stole it. So there's a double thing going on here. There's a theft, and then there's a sale or a slaughter. Ganavu machar b'Shabbat. Now we're on a different topic. Let's say I stole it, and sold it on Shabbat. So am I liable the payment of the 4 or 5? Now, why wouldn't I be? Well, if you remember, we've learned already a number of times, kim lebe de rabba mineh. If you're liable for one action that at the same moment you committed an action that makes you liable the death penalty, and at the same time you incurred a financial payment, you don't pay the money. So if you do an action on Shabbat that you get killed for, which is not selling an object is not forbidden by Torah law. It's not one of the lamatet melacha. You're not allowed to do it, but it's a derabbanan. Because maybe you'll come to write, maybe you'll write. There's all things about doing business dealings, a problem on Shabbat for all sorts of reasons, but not by Torah law. You certainly won't get killed. Now, obviously, what's the flip case? If you slaughtered it on Shabbat, slaughtering is a melacha. So then you'd be obligated. That's why it only says if you stole it and sold it on Shabbat. Okay, our Mishna is going to discuss all the cases where you do pay Arba Chamisha. The next Mishna is going to bring the parallel cases where you won't pay Arba Chamisha, because there you'll be liable to the death penalty and you'll be exempt from payment. Ganavu machar lavodah zara. Again, if you slaughter for idols, you're already incurring the death penalty. If you sell something for idol worship, you don't incur the death penalty. So because you don't incur the death penalty, you're going to pay the Arba Chamisha. Ganav v'tavach b'Yom Kippurim. You stole and you slaughtered it on Yom Kippur. Now, slaughtering on Yom Kippur does not make you liable the death penalty. You're liable karet in the hands of God, but not in a court of law. And only kimle b'deravamine only applies when it's in a court of law, like a death by the court. Ganav. Okay, now we're moving on to a different type thing. Ganav mishel aviv. Again, there's going to be parallel to this in the next Mishnah. If you stole something of your father's, and then you'll see why the relevance of your father in a minute, tavachu machal, and then while your father was still alive, you slaughtered it or sold it, v'achar kach meit aviv, and then your father died. Now at this point, who do you have to pay back? Your brothers and yourself. So you're kind of a party to the whole thing now because you're supposed to then pay yourself, right? Which basically means you. So in the end, you're going to have to pay 4 or 5 to the brothers. Now this isn't such a big chidush. What's the chidush? If you slaughtered it after the father was dead, then already it's going to be a different story because you ended up slaughtering an animal that was partially owned by you. So you don't pay 4 or 5 in that case. We'll get to that later. This case actually has no chiddush whatsoever. It's really here because of the flip case. Okay, again, the parallel case in the next Mishna. If you slaughtered, you stole, you slaughtered, and then you sanctified it later, okay, which has no bearing because you already incurred the payment of the 4 or 5 before you sanctified it. The whole difference is going to be, what if you sanctified it before it was slaughtered, before you slaughtered it and then slaughtered it? That would be something else because it was already not owned by the person because you sanctified it. But anyway, here, so again, there's nothing unique here. You sold it, you slaughtered it, you already incurred the 4 or 5 payment. Then you happen to have sanctified it. Obviously, you still pay the 4 or 5 payment. New section. This is all going to be slaughtering it. Okay, we assume when you slaughter something, why are you slaughtering it? To eat it. That's the main way you slaughter something. What if you slaughtered it for the purposes of medicine, medicinal purposes? You wanted the meat for some medicinal thing. You know, even maybe to eat for medicinal purposes. Liklavim, where you wanted to throw it to the dogs. Or or you slaughtered it and it turns out it was a treifa. It wasn't a kosher shchita, so you can't eat it. Or if you take an animal that wasn't sanctified and you slaughter it inside the temple, you're not allowed to do that. You can only slaughter sacrifices in the temple. If you do that, it becomes forbidden to benefit from. So the last 2 cases are cases where you actually can't eat it. 1, it wasn't a kosher shchita. 2, you took chulim, which are not allowed to be slaughtered in the temple, and you slaughtered them in the temple, and it's now you can't eat them. So all these cases, you basically slaughter them, even though you either don't plan to eat them or you can't eat them. There's kind of 2 categories here, and it's important to say 2 in a minute. You'll see why. In any case, we don't care why you were slaughtering it. We don't care how you slaughter it. We don't care if it's now forbidden to eat. It doesn't matter. You did an act of slaughtering. It's an act of slaughtering. It's considered tavach, according to the Torah. Rabbi Shimon potel b'shnei elu. Rabbi Shimon disagrees about the last 2 cases. He says, what are you talking about? The last 2 cases are not shchita at all. He holds, and the Gemara, the Rashi points this out, that in general, Rabbi Shimon holds, in the Rashi, Dibor matchil b'shnei elu, b'treifa, u'b'chulim b'azara. Tikasava Rabbi Shimon, shchita she'ena ru'uya lo shma shchita. If you slaughter something that is not, you can't, it's not kosher because it's a treifa, let's say, or you slaughter it inside the azara, and now you're not allowed to benefit from it at all, which means you can't eat it, that's not actually defined as shchita. If it's not defined as shchita, then you didn't do what the Torah said of vishachat, right? Or it said v'tavach. But you didn't fulfill that. You didn't do it. It's not a shchita at all. So there's a debate about that. He says, obviously, so Rashi continues, l'refuah the klavim, it's a shchita ru'uya, because if you change your mind about it and decide you want to eat the meat, normally, then you would. So you could. So therefore, that's a shchita, but the other 2 cases are not. So we had a whole bunch of different sections here, and now we're going to start dealing with them one by one. So today we'll only get to some of them. So now we're going to go back to the first thing, which basically said that we can convict you of paying the 4 or 5 payment, even if 2 different sets of witnesses came. 2 said you stole, and 2 said that you slaughtered or sold. Lema manitin de lo Rabbi Akiva. So does it mean then that our Mishna doesn't follow Rabbi Akiva? Why? What does Rabbi Akiva say? Rabbi Akiva Hama davar lo chatzi davar. Rabbi Akiva says, when it says in the Torah, al pishnayim edim yakum davar, based on 2 witnesses, it will establish something. Has to be a davar is a matter. Will decide the matter. The matter has to be complete matter by those 2 witnesses. It can't be half a matter. Now here, tavach is half, and ganav is half. So each one is only doing half of the situation. So because to make you liable 4 or 5, you have, one on the double and then the other on the second part. Now, how do we know that he says this? Did Tanya, we're going to get a little bit of a background story here. I'm Rabbi Yossi. Kashalach Abba Chalafta Etzel Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Rabbi Yossi telling the story that when Abba Chalafta went to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri lamod Torah, or Amrila, some people say it was the reverse, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri went to Etzel Abba Chalafta lamod Torah, turning out to Amabet. Okay, we don't know who said who. One said to the other the following thing, and the other responded. Okay, we don't know if it's Abba Chalafta or Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri who started and the other one who continued. Okay, anyway, let's just see what they said. Amarlo. Okay, what's our topic? Our topic here is chazaka on land. If I live in a property for 3 years and you don't complain, you don't say, hey, get off, that's my property. And after 3 years, you come and say, hey, you're living on my property. If I can prove that I was living there for 3 years and there's no proof that you complained at all, then I can have rights to that. Now, normally nowadays you'd have to prove, you have registry and the land authority that this is mine. Now, the assumption there was, why don't we require a document? Well, there was a concern that after 3 years, people lose documents. Either the mice would eat them up or, just someone might lose it. So we basically give other ways where you can prove your ownership. So if you've been living there for 3 years and no one complained, the assumption is it's not really your land. You would have complained before. So what I have to do to prove this is I have to prove that I lived there for 3 years. So I have to bring testimony. Now, what kind of testimony? I might not find someone who saw me all 3 years living there. So if I have, so here comes the case. One said to the other the following thing. If I was eating in the land, that means basically taking the produce of the land, shows that I was using it, right? Let's say it's a field. I wasn't living there, but I was the one collecting all the food from there. And I prove by 2 witnesses that year number 1, I was living there. And then I have 2 other witnesses that say the same thing about the second year. And shlishi b'fnei shnayim mahu. Now this is chatzi davar, because each one only testified to 1 year. 1 year is not anything. I need 3, but I have 1 year with 2, 1 year with 2, and 1 year with 2, different groups of 2 witnesses each year. Amar lo harezo chazaka. So the first guy asks, what's the halacha? The second guy answers, it's a chazaka. Because again, I'm calling them first guy, second guy, because we don't know who started the discussion, who's responding. Amar lo afani omer ken. So the other guy says, after asking the question, the other one said, yes, it works. The other guy says, I think so too. But ella Rabbi Akiva cholek b'davar. But I know that Rabbi Akiva disagrees. And that's probably why he was asking him, because he said, I knew the answer to that question, but I know that Rabbi Akiva disagrees. Shaya Rabbi Akiva omer davar v'lo chatzi davar, because Rabbi Akiva said it's davar v'lo chatzi davar. So now we're going to assume Rabbi Akiva would say the same thing by us. Doesn't work. You can't convict someone of tvicha based on 2 witnesses saying he stole and 2 witnesses saying he slaughtered the animal, because that's only a chatzi davar. If, again, like I said in the beginning, if 2 witnesses come and say I slaughtered an animal, I don't pay 4 or 5. I just slaughtered an animal. That's an independent action that has nothing to do with anything unless I had stolen before. So Amar Abai, Afilu Tema Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi says, what are you talking about? The Gemara had said, all this was the suggestion of the Gemara. Are we to say that our Mishnah doesn't follow Rabbi Akiva? Because this is what Rabbi Akiva says. To which Abai says, Milo moda Rabbi Akiva, b'shnayim omrim kidesh, b'shnayim omrim ba'al. Ta'af agav de'edi biyat tzricha le'edi kiddushin, kevan de'edi kiddushin lo tzricha le'edi biyat, davar karina me. I read that kind of fast, but let's go back and explain. If 2 witnesses convict a woman of sleeping with another man, committing adultery, what do they have to prove? Now, if a woman is seen by witnesses as having relations with a man, that's not valid unless what? They can't kill her unless it's clear that she was married or betrothed before. So basically, we have 2 witnesses that come and say, this man slept with this woman, we saw it happen. But they're not the same 2 witnesses likely who were the witnesses who witnessed the kiddushin, the betrothal, right? So he says the following. Now let's read it inside again. I'll go back. He says, wouldn't Rabbi Akiva agree, though, in that case, we would accept those 2 witnesses, even though they're not testifying about the complete picture? Because again, this is very similar to us. What's slaughtering if it's your own, right? What's sleeping with a woman if she's not betrothed to somebody else? It's nothing without that. You need the original witnesses to establish that it was a stolen item. You need the original witnesses to establish that she was betrothed. but you don't necessarily need them to be the same. That would be ridiculous. We'd never end up having capital punishment for a betrothal unless, for a married woman sleeping with someone else, unless they happen to have also witnessed the betrothal. That doesn't make any sense. And basically they're saying, what wouldn't Rabbi Akiva be moded? B'shnayim omrim kidesh, if two witnesses came and said, oh yeah, we know this woman was betrothed. And Shnayim omrim, and a different two witnesses came and said, Baal, she had relation. Now here he sets it up very nicely. He says, even though the Eidei Bia need the Eidei Kiddushin, right? The second ones are baseless unless they have the support of the first group. But Kevan the Eidei Kiddushin lo tzricha le'Eidei Bia. But the first witnesses stand on their own without the Eidei Bia. In other words, if we want to establish this woman's betrothed for any which reason, we have those first two witnesses stand on their own, they're independent. The witnesses who said, you sat on this property for a year, don't do anything. But the witnesses who say she was betrothed, actually, right, let's say now she claims I was divorced, right? So if we have Eidei Kiddushin, that she was actually betrothed, right, she's going to have to prove that she was divorced, right? Otherwise, we don't even have proof she was married. She doesn't have to necessarily prove she's divorced. But right, there's all sorts of ramifications for those Eidei Kiddushin. They should clearly stand on their own to prove the woman was betrothed. So since they stand on their own, therefore the second group also stands on their own. Okay, so that's our proof that even according to Rabbi Akiva, who holds davar v'lo chatzi davar, this is not a case of that. So still davar karina base. So hachanami, likewise in our case. Now let's do the comparison. In order to prove that you're going to pay the 4 or 5 payment, and the slaughterers are going to, the one who said you slaughter are going to have to be based on the earlier witnesses that said you stole. Otherwise, it would be irrelevant. But, right, right? So even though those don't need those, the Eidei Geneva stand on their own. Two witnesses come and say you stole, you're going to have to pay double payment based on that testimony. That's a complete testimony in and of itself. And therefore, davar karina. Therefore, that's a davar, and therefore the Eidei Tvicha can be separate and a separate group. So what we've done right now is we suggested that maybe the Mishna doesn't match Rabbi Akiva. We reject that. We say, no. Abaye says our Mishna matches Rabbi Akiva. There's a distinction between the cases of chazaka and these cases here. So now the Gemara says, V'Rabbanan hay davar v'lo chatzi davar l'mi'utei mai. The rabbis say, now we want to know, not the rabbis say, what do the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Akiva, what do they do with the fact that it says davar, and we assume davar means complete testimony. What is considered incomplete testimony according to the rabbis? We understand according to Rabbi Akiva, what's incomplete testimony? 1 year of chazaka, which in and of itself does nothing. But the rabbis think that that's valid. The rabbis think that you could do 1 year. That's like a unit. And second year is a unit. Third year is a unit. You can combine them all together for the complete picture. So what case do they not think is okay? So first they suggest that then they immediately say, no way is this, because this is even worse than anything. Now we're talking about saying that a woman has two hairs on her body and has reached the age of maturity. So now, we're not going to get into the details of where exactly this is on her body, but one says we saw a hair there, and the other says we saw a hair somewhere else. So one witness said one, and one witness said the other. That's not even anything, because forget about that. You need two, right? Two simanim, but you need two witnesses to testify about anything. And here you only have one witness testify about one hair and one about the second hair. That nobody would even suggest that would be an issue, because you don't even have two witnesses about any one thing. It must be coming to exclude. You would need two witnesses about one hair and two witnesses about the other hair. And that the rabbis would say is no good. Why? Now you have to distinguish, and this is actually very complicated because the commentators don't really understand right away why it's different. You'd have to distinguish between this and the case of the chazaka. This actually sounds pretty similar to the chazaka. Each one is testifying. We have two witnesses, a complete testimony about something partial. 1 hair, 1 year, okay? And only with 2 hairs is it anything. Only with 3 years is it anything. It actually sounds kind of similar. So what does the Gemara say? What's the difference? Hane amre ktanahi v'hane amre ktanahi. By us talking about 1 hair, by 2 witnesses saying 1 hair, each one's actually saying she only has 1 hair, which means she's a minor, because all we saw was 1 hair. And that's different from the sitting on the property, because each one was testifying about a year. Okay, now that doesn't sound so different. If you each say 1 year, you're also saying you don't have rights to the land because it was only 1 year. So we're going to have to figure this out. So I'll bring you, there's a lot of opinions about the commentaries here, what the real distinction is. We'll read inside Tosfot for a minute. Okay, at the beginning of Tosfot quotes 2 possible answers here as to what the real distinction is. Why? It's not like 1 year. 1 year, 1 hair, they're not the same, even though both are a part of something bigger. The 1 year is a complete testimony because what they said is, we saw this person living on the land for the whole year. That's a complete testimony. We saw everything we could have seen that year. If one said we saw a hair in this place and the other said we saw a hair in that place, well, that means that neither one saw the whole picture because each one is saying there's a hair there and there's a hair there, but they didn't see everything they could have seen. So that's a really incomplete testimony. It has to be really incomplete. That's one way of looking at it. Rav Alfasi quotes the Rif as saying, Mishum dahatam mahani sahadutayu le'inyam perot she'achal b'shana rishona shechayav l'shalem im lo yotza yoter edim. The second answer doesn't really work well with the words, as they said she's a ketana and they said she's a ketana, but what they're basically saying is there's no halachic significance to saying she has 1 hair. But there is halachic significance to saying she lived on the land for a year. Because if in the end we can't prove from the others that she lived in the land for 3 years, then we can actually take away all the produce she took. If the witness, right, it's like the witness is going to turn into the opposite of what it tried to do, which is the witness tried to say she lived in the land and therefore it's hers. But in the end, if we don't have other witnesses that come along with that testimony, then in the end, that witness can make her obligated to return all the produce she took from that year to the original owner. Okay, the weakness of this is the answer the Gemara gives is the distinction is they said she's a ketana, whereas it sounded like the chazaka was only establishing where we wanted it to establish. And this actually flips it, is it is actually establishing the opposite, which is kind of what the Gemara was saying about the minor, that they seem to be establishing the opposite. So it's a bit of a weak commentary. And in fact, the next line in Rash, in Tosfot is Tam Rishon Nireli Ri'ikar. He doesn't really go with the second one. But anyway, like I said, it's a little complicated to figure out. And I don't mean complicated like we can't understand. What I mean is the commentary struggled with trying to really figure out what's the distinction in the end. Now we're moving on to the next section. Ganav umachal b'Shabbat. So the first problem is going to be Vahatanya, or this is the main problem we're going to deal with today. Vahatanya patul. But isn't there a braita that says same thing, Ganav umachal b'Shabbat, but instead of saying you have to pay the 4 or 5, it says you're exempt from paying the 4 or 5. So now it's confusing. Right? We understand Shabbat, you're exempt because you slaughtered. You did a melacha on Shabbat. You're liable for the death penalty. That's going to exempt you from the payment. But if you sold it on Shabbat, you don't get the death penalty for that. So why does this other braita say you're exempt? Doesn't make sense. So number 1, it contradicts, and number 2, it doesn't really make sense, the second braita. So what we're going to do in this section is we're going to give, Rami bar Chama is going to give an answer. Then Rav Papa is going to give a different answer. We're going to end up with, there's a question on Rabbi Chama. Rav Papa is going to provide a different answer. And then Rav is going to come back and reestablish Rami bar Chama's answer and resolve the problem that we have with it. So I'm a Rami bar Chama. Kitanya hahide patul. What we're going to do to both these answers are going to be what we call ukimtot. We're going to say that braita was in a particular case. We're going to have to come up with a case where at the moment of the sale, the moment the sale kicked in, they were obligated also the death penalty. So how could that be? Well, if he said, one said to the other, right, the one who was, okay, what happened? Let's say Ruth steals, let's go back to Ruth and Naomi. Ruth steals from Naomi and sells to Yael. So remember, there's the Ganav and Machal, and she sells to Yael on Shabbat. So we have to have a way that the moment she sells it and the moment it becomes Yael's, at that exact moment, Ruth is obligated the death penalty. So what would be the case? Be'omerlo, when she goes to sell it to Yael, Yael says to her, go pick one of my figs, and as you pick the fig, right, you'll take the figs, and with that, when you take the fig as payment, the animal will be acquired by me. Many people say the animal has to be in her courtyard for it to take effect at the exact moment that Ruth picks the figs, but we won't get into all those details. But the fact is, when Ruth picks the fig, which is forbidden to do on Shabbat, melacha of kotzer, of reaping, when she picks the fig, exact moment the mechira will be done, the sale will be exactly happen at that moment, and Ruth will be liable to the death penalty for picking the figs. Amre, but they say, wait a minute. וכיוון דחיתבה לקמן בדינה, לא אמרין על נזיל שלים, דמתחייב בנפשו הוא. This is not considered a sale, they're basically going to say. Because what? If this sale happened in this way, that Ruth, as the sale took effect, she did a melacha on Shabbat. What would happen if the next day Yael says, listen, I didn't know it was stolen. I want to give it back to you and I want my figs back. Could she get her figs back from Ruth? No, she couldn't. Why couldn't she get them back? Because since at that moment where she had, right, where she took the figs, she was liable the death penalty. She also gets exempt from any monetary thing that comes along with it. So if Yael says, give me back my figs and take back your animal, I don't want it, it can't be undone because we can't obligate Ruth in court to give back that money because there's no way to do it because she already was mitchayev b'nafshat, right? She was already liable the death penalty. So therefore, they say the following, and this we'll debate later, and this is how Rav is going to reinstate because he's going to say, I don't agree with this. But comes the Gemara and says, ha-mechira, nami lav mechira. Since it can't be undone, there's a very interesting concept. Since you can't undo the sale, therefore it's not a sale. In order for something to be a sale, it has to be a sale that can be undone. This sale can't be undone, so it's not a sale. If it's not a sale, well then Ruth didn't ganva umachara. She didn't sell it. She stole it, but the sale wasn't considered an actual sale, so it's not actually gneva umachira. And that's why we can't say that this is the case. Okay, it's a bit of a weird assumption, and the Gemara is going to challenge the assumption soon. So Rav Papa suggests something else. Ela amar Rav Papa. Ba'omer lo zrok gnevutayach lechatzerai v'tikni li gnevutayach. Yael says, throw me the animal into my field. Okay, I guess it would have to be more the goat. A little hard to throw a cow. Throw it to me into my courtyard, and I will acquire it when my courtyard will acquire it, basically. Now, Kiman, they're going to say, wait, this doesn't hold by everybody because let's go back to the first Mishna in Shabbat. Who remembers? You need to have akira and hanacha. In order to be liable, what happened here is you passed it from the public domain to a private domain. Now, you needed to both leave the public, which it did when you threw it, and land in the private, which has to be land on the ground. Now, the chatzer of Yael can acquire it, the courtyard, just as soon as it comes into the airspace of her property, it's already acquired, which means in order to have kimle, has to all happen at the same time. Now, if you say, right, if she throws it, the second it gets into the airspace, it's considered sold. But only when it lands on the ground are you liable for Shabbat. So that's not kimle. To which the Gemara says you would have to say, we started the daf with this, with the Gemara with this isn't like Rabbi Akiva. This you would have to say is like Rabbi Akiva. Only. Kiman ki Rabbi Akiva damar kluta kamosha unchadami. By the way, it's not the Mishna, it's the braita we're talking about. So if you remember this, Rabbi Akiva says something going through airspace is as if it landed right there. And therefore, as soon as it gets into the airspace of Yael's courtyard, it's as if it landed on the ground and you'd be liable for Shabbat at the exact same moment you'd be liable for the theft. And then that would explain the braita, why you're exempt. Rabbanan, if it holds like Rabbanan, this braita, exactly as we said. When it gets into the airspace of the courtyard, it already is acquired. It was the sale. But in terms of Shabbat, unless it reaches the ground, you're not obligated. To which they answer, no, it could be, okay, ukimta and ukimta. Not only is it the case where she says, throw it to me, but she says the following. If you say the words, it won't be, right, throw it to me and it won't be mine until it reaches the ground, then you could have a case where the braita would say patur. Okay, it's already pretty extreme to say that's what the braita was saying, and the braita didn't say anything of the sort, but okay. Rav Amar lo olam ki Rami bar Chama. He goes back to Rami bar Chama. He proves now from the case of an etnan, of a gift given to a prostitute, that a sale that can't be undone is still considered a sale, okay, or a gift or a giving of something. Etnan asra Torah va'afilu ba'alimo. A gift given to a prostitute cannot, or a payment to a prostitute cannot be used as a sacrifice, even if it was a man who slept with his mother. Now, a man who sleeps with his mother is mitchayev b'nafsho, right? So therefore, now what would be the case? Itava lekama bedina. If she brings him to court and says, hey, you never gave me the gift that you said, the payment for okay, it's a hard thing to imagine a son, solicits his mother for prostitution, but if he did, and she goes to court, mi amrina lekum havla etnan, we're not going to obligate him to give the etnan because he was obligated to give her the etnan from the act of sexual relations with the mother, which caused him the death penalty. So he's not going to have to give it to her. And yet, even though she can't really collect this in court, but if he does give it to her, it is an etnan, even though, right, she can't collect it in a court of law. So hachanami, likewise, you could say the same thing here. Even if, right, if she goes and says in a court of law, she will not be able to obligate her to pay. Okay, in the end, since he did give it to her, right, she did take the figs, the sale, and she took the animal, the sale was a sale, and therefore you could say it's that case too. Okay, so basically, let's go back to the beginning of our daf. We started with, again, this all sorts of things, or one possible psak of Nehardea, according to one version that comes out of that statement of Rabbi Yochanan, about Shneim lo yicholim lakdish zeh lefi she'eino shelo, zeh lefi she'eino b'shuto. From there, we got all into this thing about these orkhetas that they would write and different things that have to be written in them and all sorts of possible ramifications, how power of attorney worked in those days, or at least a particular type of power of attorney. Then we went to this Mishna where we dealt the first section of the Mishna about the two witnesses and does this only hold like the rabbis, not Rabbi Akiva, davar v'lo chatzi davar, to which we then distinguished between that case and the case of chazaka and said here actually we would accept it. And then we moved on to the ganav machar b'Shabbat, brought a braita that contradicted, but then explained that the braita must be in a particular case where there was a chiyuv of Shabbat happened at the same time. It was a little complicated to figure out how we could get that exact case and who it would exactly hold like, but we resolved it in two possible ways and gave two possible explanations. That's it for today. Wishing everybody a good day, a chodesh tov. Let it be a chodesh that brings some better tidings. Have a good day, everyone.